Now, good morning everybody, and thank you very much for allowing me to have here. Thank you to our hosts, and thank you for coming up this early in the morning. It's a pleasure to be here, and as always, luck favors the prepared mind. Serendipity is wonderful. Coming to Australia from an area where I come from, which basically is the European manufacturing belt, which is made up of Switzerland, Germany, Sweden, and Finland, basically. And who has lived in a high-cost environment for a very long time. We really don't know anything else. And coming down to Australia, to a country that I will show recently has entered into a high-cost environment over the last 5 years or so. It's wonderful because I can talk about things that are natural to us that may or may not be of interest to you. So it's great, isn't it? I don't even have to prepare. That's one of those things. So what I thought I'd do is I'll talk a little bit about making it in a high-cost environment, and then of course I'm happy to take questions on other type of issues in white if you have any of those things, because there are some issues around those that relate to policy making and decision making in businesses. So as I said early on, Australia has gone to a high-cost environment. The way you measure that, there's a lot of economic complexity around price parity indexes. The one I like the most because it's easiest to understand is the Mcdonald Index, and it actually correlates very well with all those complex other economic measures that OECD uses. And if you look at that, one tends to say that the low-cost environments is those which has a cost level that is lower than the US, and a high-cost environment is those that have a cost level that is higher than the US. And Australia has since 2008 migrated from being about 5% or so lower than the US to today being about 20% more expensive. Now, if you look to the furthest right there, you have a few countries which are substantially more expensive and have been so for a very long time. And it's a little bit about those I'm going to talk. Because interesting enough, with the exception of Norway, who does mostly oil export but still have a good industry, they are all making things, and they are making things very well. Switzerland, which is up there on the far right and is very expensive. Anybody who's been having a steak in Switzerland knows that's about a month's salary to do that. They have an export surplus with China, which has the same size as Australia's, for a population the third the size. And it's not about selling dirt. It is about selling primarily machine tools. Sophisticated equipment that cannot be made elsewhere. And that's part of the issue. So I'll start with a little bit of a simple overview around what the differences are, and I'll cover then in detail some of them. And I'll start with challenging a few things. When you live in a low-cost environment, from that tends to follow that most of your firms are imitators rather than innovators. So you wait until something is proven elsewhere, then you take it in, it has a low risk, it contributes to reducing your cost. So in that world, in de facto, one of the most important assumptions that underpin neoclassical economic theory, the assumption that innovation sits outside the economy and cannot be impacted, holds reasonably true, right? So you can work very well with a neoclassical lens in such world. And that has a set of implications. Whereas in a high-cost environment, you can't work with that assumption. It does no longer hold true. In a high-cost environment, you have to continuously create advantages that you did not have before. We tend to call them competitive advantages rather than comparative advantages, which we tend to talk about in neoclassical economics. And that means that you have to make the assumption that innovation sits inside the economy and that you can impact it. This means that your economic lens is completely different. Now, economics, I'm an engineer, all right, so I'm not sure I want to call economics a science, but anyway, economics as a knowledge domain is like any other knowledge domains. We constantly learn new things, and we constantly question and query things. So, a certain assumption we made 200 years ago may no longer hold true because we live in a different world. One of the interesting experiences I've had in Australia is that economics here seems to have gone through kind of 3 steps. In the first step, it was a very good body of knowledge where Australia had some major contributions in the field of academic research and thinking. From that, it became an ideology. Yeah, you can understand that. That's where it is in places like the UK and in the US and so on. But it has migrated one step further here. Now it is a religion. And what characterizes a religion is you can't query it. Right? And if you can't query it, you can't move on. You can't learn new things. You get dogmatic. And one of the things we have in the manufacturing belt is we have given up on neoclassical economics because the assumptions don't hold true for us. So we work in a world of evolutionary economics, for those who are interested in that, sometimes known as innovation economics, and also behavioral economics. The other area is around the competition basis. Of course, in low-cost environment, you compete on low cost. In high-cost environment, you compete on high value for money. And that's a big distinction, because high value for money does not have to be the cheapest. It just has to have the highest value for money. So, of course, efficiency is important, but it is secondary to high value for money. Time horizons tend to be, in the low-cost environment, tends to be relatively short. You need to get instantaneous payback. You have a number of things. Whereas in a high-cost environment, it tends to be long-term. You invest continuously in things like R&D, for which you will have the fruition and benefit many years from now. The innovation focus is different. Australia has a fantastic capability. I have never come across anything as good as Australia when it comes to tactical problem solving. I have a problem, I come to a firm here, they fix it, right? It's, Outback mechanic comes to mind if I've been told it once, right? A piece of wire and a piece of plywood, you can fix anything. Yeah, it's one of those things. But what it means is that the innovation thinking is reactive rather than proactive. It responds to a request. And the interesting thing about that is that you don't get very long series for that. It's a one-off type scenario constantly. And whereas in the high-cost environment, we don't work. We are very bad at that. We are extremely bad at that. But what we are good at is identifying a problem that matters for a long period of time for a large group of people, and then working towards solving that problem. And that means we have strategic innovation, and we are very good at that. Innovation behavior here tends to be arbitrage. Can I get something quickly and cheaply, make a bit of money of it and move on? All right. Whereas in the high-cost environment, we can't do that. We have to have continuous work to create value, and then we have to work heavily to appropriate that value so the next guy in the supply chain doesn't get what we create. And the implication for government is that on the low-cost environment, you tend to use supply-side tools, tax credits, grants, all those type of things. And on the high-cost environment, you tend to use demand-side tools, cluster policies, procurement, and regulation. And by the way, there are industries that do not innovate unless you use regulation. Classical example would be construction industry. Other issues are things like automotive industry. Their innovation is primarily driven by regulation. So don't knock regulation when it comes to an innovation tool. We don't want regulation that drives cost, but we want regulation that increases competitiveness of industry through innovation. The interesting difference between those two tools is that the supply side tool drives activity, whereas the demand side tool drives outcome. It's a fundamental difference. If I use procurement, you won't get paid until you deliver, right? So I pay you for an outcome. If I use an R&D tax credit, I drive an activity which is normally reclassification of overheads. And also this, and I have studied those things in detail in a number of countries, and that's actually what happens in more than 90% of firms. But of course, if you reclassify them, you report more. You don't do more, but you report more. And if you then sit on the macroeconomic level and look at the numbers, it looks like it works, because you spend money and more R&D gets reported. It's just that more R&D doesn't get done